This is a University of Otago podcast.
Good evening. It is fantastic to have you all here with us this evening, and as is typical for these auspicious occasions, it's great to see members of our general and academic staff, students from the University of Otago, and members of the general public, as well as representation from the University Council. In addition, however, we have a couple of other special welcomes to make this evening. David's wife, Rebecca, is here, and his daughter, Rachel. And I understand that son, Ben, might possibly be watching us via live stream, so we can all have a shout out to Ben. He is currently on his semester abroad at the University of Sydney. I'm sure many of you know that Professor Toombs is the Howard Patterson Chair in Public Theology and the Director of the Center for Theology and Public Issues. And by way of background, I just want to remind you that this particular chair has been made possible by some very generous donations. Howard Patterson actually studied the phenomenology of religion at Otago, and throughout his life, he actually retained an interest in theology. The Patterson Charitable Trust made a major donation towards the center, with the support also coming from the Synod of Otago and Southland and from Ian and Annette Tullich. This center was actually the first center in New Zealand to examine political, social, and economic issues from a theological perspective. And the foundation chair was Professor Andrew Bradstock. When Professor Bradstock made the decision to return to the UK for family reasons, the university launched an international search to find his replacement. And we are very pleased tonight to welcome Professor David Toombs to this position. He has come to us from Trinity College in Dublin, and he took up his position at the University of Otago in January of 2015. There is no doubt that David is a scholar with an immense international reputation. His work engages with significant contemporary issues. His published work and published lectures have tackled some really important topics like Abu Ghraib, the death of Gaddafi, and work with truth commissions in places like Timor-Leste, South Africa, Central America, and a little bit closer to his former home, Northern Ireland. His work is also extremely interdisciplinary. It is ideally suited to continue the work of Professor Bradstock, who started building links between the university and religious and secular bodies outside it. David is also a superb teacher, and he has received awards for his teaching, and he also holds a professional teaching certificate, and he is a very popular master's and PhD supervisor. David has literally worked all over the world: the US, Sri Lanka, El Salvador, and the Czech Republic. The University of Otago is delighted that he and his family have now chosen Dunedin as their home. And on behalf of the university, Professor Toombs, I would like to officially warmly welcome you to this position. I will now hand over to the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Humanities, the head of the Department of Religion and Theology, to tell us a bit more about David's history and background.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, if not for the inadvertent promotion. I'm not the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Humanities, nor will I be. Tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the department, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight, as well as to those of you watching the live stream, and to introduce to you Professor David Toombs. David took up his post as Howard Patterson Professor of Theology and Public Issues and Director of the Center for Theology and Public Issues in January of this year. He came to us from the Irish School of Ecumenics, where he was the Director of the Center for Post-Conflict Justice. Although the Irish School of Ecumenics is a part of Trinity College Dublin, for most of his time there, David worked from Belfast. And I understand that this occasionally caused some problems for postgraduate students who arrived in the country with the wrong visa. or a visa for the wrong country. Not to mention also some difficulties on occasion in explaining to the good people of Belfast the difference between ecumenics and economics. David's decision to take the job at the ISE arose directly from his interest in liberation theology, about which he's going to talk tonight, and its continuing profound legacy for those whose engagement with public issues is informed by theological reflection. The Irish School is one of the founding institutions, together with the Centre for the Theology and Public Issues at Otago, of the Global Network for Public Theology. And it was through Professor Murray Ray, who with others in the department helped to establish this network, that David first came into contact with Otago. David's interest in liberation theology goes back to his time as an undergraduate in theology and philosophy at Trinity College in Oxford in the late 1980s. And it was also nurtured subsequently by James Cone, Cornell West, and others during his STM at Union Theological Seminary in New York. After training as a teacher of religious education at the University of Birmingham, David earned his doctorate the hard way by part-time study at Haythrop College, while also lecturing in religious and theological studies at the University of Roehampton from 1992 to 2001. At Haythrop, he was supervised by two Jesuits, Dr. Joseph Leishley and Dr. James Hanvey. David also has the unusual distinction of having published a monograph before completing his PhD, entitled Latin American Liberation Theology, published by Brill in 2002. It has been described by Professor Mario Aguilar of the University of St. Andrews as the book on liberation theology. Liberation theology has long attracted the attention of theologians from a range of different traditions, including those at Otago. In 1991, Knox Theological Hall and Holy Cross College co-hosted a conference on liberation theology, and in the following year, the then Faculty of Theology at the university published a short book on the churches and the revolution in Nicaragua by a young scholar who over a decade later would go on to become the first incumbent of the Howard Patterson Chair. However, especially in the Latin American context with which David has worked, liberation theology has had a particularly Catholic and even specifically Jesuit character. It's no surprise then that Pope Francis, who is both the first Jesuit and also the first Latin American to be Pope, has recently revitalized interest in the legacies of liberation theology. When I asked David whether he regarded his own work as emerging from a distinctively Anglican intellectual tradition, he equivocated in such a way as to confirm this for certain. In addition to his shaping by the Catholic and Jesuit tradition, he constitutes an Anglican minority within his otherwise Presbyterian family, so his practical experience of ecumenics extends beyond his time in Ireland. In addition to the book already mentioned, David has published some 25 book chapters and journal articles, as well as 7 edited volumes and a number of further shorter contributions. An important and continuing theme in his work over more than 2 decades now is shame, which will also be taken up in a book on sexualized violence, crucifixion, and Christian ethics, which is currently under preparation. David's appointment to the Howard Patterson Chair and to the Centre comes at an exciting time. In his years at Otago, Andrew Bradstock did an excellent job in establishing the Centre and gaining for it a very visible public profile. He did, however, often comment on the difficulty of sustaining engagement with government from Dunedin. We are therefore delighted that with the support of St. John's in the City Presbyterian Church in Wellington, the Synod of Otago and Southland, and other donors, we have been able recently to advertise lectureship in Christian theology and public issues. The lecture will be based in Wellington, and in addition to teaching papers on public theology, which will be available to distant students throughout the country, he or she will also be tasked, under David's guidance, with establishing a presence for the Centre in Wellington and hosting events there. So David will have much to do, but first I invite him to deliver his inaugural professorial lecture, Latin American Theology, Liberation Theology, and its Ongoing Legacy.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My thanks to the Vice-Chancellor and to my Head of Department for the kind words in welcoming me. To my colleagues here at the University, in the Division and in the Department, for the exceptionally warm welcome that you have given me coming to Dunedin. to the visionaries and generous supporters of this extraordinary and privileged academic position, the Howard Patterson Chair and Director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, and to Kirsten Eyre, our Administrative Assistant, who keeps the whole show on the road in a calm and efficient way. And to you all for coming. Welcome. It's my great pleasure to speak on Latin American liberation theology and why I believe that it has an ongoing legacy for Christian theology in the 21st century. I took liberation theology as the topic for this lecture because I've been very influenced by it since I first learned about it as an undergraduate, and because all of a sudden, liberation theology is once again featuring in newspaper headlines. This front page photo in the New York Times on 24th May 2015 featured a mural to Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador, who was murdered at the altar on 24 March 1980. The mural names Romero as Saint Romero of America. It was headlined, "Pope's Focus on Poor Revives Scorned Theology." The news story describes how 6 months after becoming the first Latin American pontiff, Pope Francis invited the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, who was widely acknowledged as the founding father of Latin American liberation theology, for a meeting at his Vatican residence. In the 1980s, an invitation to Rome might have been a cause of concern for Gutierrez. But this invitation marked a much more cordial attitude towards him and his work. It's no coincidence that soon after his appointment, Pope Francis also took steps to address the difficulties which were preventing progress in the canonization of Romero. Although Romero has long been spoken of as San Romero by many in Latin America, and they have worked tirelessly for his sainthood to be reflected in the formal canonization process, prior to Francis, the case seemed to be stalled. By contrast, under Francis, Romero was declared to be a martyr to the faith, and his beatification followed on 23rd May 2015, almost 35 years to the day since his murder. Beatification is a crucial stage in the canonization process, which now looks to be firmly back on course. This is not to say that Romero or liberation theology no longer have hostile critics. The statue in San Salvador was vandalized at the time of his beatification. You can see it as it was before on the left and subsequently on the right. His right hand, holding the cross, was cut off, presumably to signal that in the eyes of his opponents, far from being remembered as a saint, he would not even be remembered as a member of the church. Cutting the hand off the statue to send a political message is also a reminder of some of the worst days of conflict in El Salvador, when death squads sometimes cut off the left hand of their victims to signal that they had killed a suspected leftist. But elsewhere, a much more positive view of liberation theology and its legacy has come to the fore. This can be seen in Francis' own writing, especially in his encyclical Laudato Si on the environment, which has been described by one commentator as the most significant statement on theology and public issues ever. Amongst other things, it links the urgent need for care of the planet with a special concern for the poor. And we might also expect to hear echoes of liberation theology during Francis' visit to the United States later this month. This evening, I hope to speak to three areas. First, my encounters with the works in liberation theology at different points in my studies and career. Second, what I think made it distinctive as a theology, how it developed and grew as a movement, and why I believe that although it is unlikely to ever return as a movement in church and society along the lines that it had in the 1970s and 1980s, nonetheless, it has left a vital legacy for Christian theology in the 21st century. Third, how it might influence a theological response to pressing public issues of our day, including torture, sexual abuse, and the refugee crisis. So there's a lot to do, and I'm under strict instructions not to speak for more than a couple of hours. So I better get started. Let me begin with a little bit about myself. I was born in a faraway place on the outer edge of London, which in turn, as you all know, is a distant land virtually on the outer edge of the world map, and quite unlike the wonderful centrality that we are blessed with here in Middle-earth. I grew up in a committed Christian family which took religious faith seriously. At school, I was encouraged by a fearless teacher of religious studies, Ian Walker, to think more about biblical criticism and what implications it had for faith. How much of the Bible was true? How did we know this? What difference did it make? To explore these questions further, I had an opportunity to go to Oxford to study for a BA in philosophy and theology. And I spent hours in the theology section of the Bodleian Library, which was the lower floor of the Radcliffe Camera pictured here. At the end of my first year, I accompanied my older brother on a summer trip to travel and volunteer on a small community development project in Peru, at a time when the armed conflict with Sendero Luminoso was still intense, and the violence and difficulties in Peruvian society were very apparent. Soon after my return from Peru for my second year at Oxford, I noticed this book in the theology section of Blackwell's bookshop. I was drawn to the picture on the front cover, and sorry it's a little small. But it's a study in stark contrasts, which were quite familiar to me from my trip to Peru, but were not at all familiar to me from a year sitting in the theology reading room. Up above, there are lines of military-style police in distinctive helmets. Beneath, there are people in a very poor neighbourhood, separated by the title, A Theology of Liberation. There's an implied question on how these two scenes are related and what this has to do with theology. So I tracked the book down in the library. I was a student, so I couldn't buy it myself, but I went to the library and read further into liberation theology and what it had to offer. This had to be fitted around the rest of the theology syllabus, since liberation theology did not feature in its own right. But my generous tutor at Trinity College, Trevor Williams, was supportive of his students following their own theological interests, and I will always be grateful to him for this. As I sat in the library reading more about liberation theology and its relevance in Latin America, I also thought more about religion closer to home, in the multicultural and multi-faith context of Britain in the 1980s, and what difference religious beliefs made to how people lived. In the last year of my BA, I decided that I want to explore this side of the question further. I applied to the University of Birmingham to train as a teacher of multi-faith religious education in state secondary schools. Before doing so, however, I was lucky to be offered a scholarship to go to Union Theological Seminary in New York for a one-year master's degree in theology. And this was too good an opportunity to miss, since it would allow me to do a whole year's further specialist work on liberation theology and look at not just Latin American, but also other contexts. The seminary, quite different to what I expected, was in a beautiful building located on Broadway between Columbia University and Riverside Church on Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I had a wonderful year there. There were many influential professors at Union and opportunities to study liberation theologies in different contexts, including Asian liberation theology, where it engaged with a multicultural context, multi-faith context, and feminist liberation theologies, which asked a very different set of questions. Some of the most challenging questions were asked by James Cone, the founding figure of Black liberation theology. And one piece of advice he offered to graduate students that has stuck with me is when you study theology, you should look for what questions are not being asked. At the end of the year, I spent the summer of 88 travelling overland by a succession of buses of varied quality, across Mexico, across the US first, then across Mexico, then on to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. El Salvador at that time was still suffering its civil war, which had broken out in the year that Romero had been assassinated and lasted throughout the whole of the 1980s. It was an interesting time to be travelling in Central America and seeing the work of the church in places like San Francisco Gotera, pictured here, which was on the boundary of the area controlled by government forces and the area held by rebel groups. There was a lot more I wanted to learn about the church in Central America, and it was tempting to enroll on the PhD program back at Union and Columbia and continue my studies there. But I decided to stick with the original plan and learn more about religious diversity in the context of the UK. So I went to Birmingham to train as a teacher, as planned, and started learning about other religious traditions as well as Christianity for the first time. After completing my year's training, I was lucky enough to find a job at Lambton Comprehensive School in West London. This was an opportunity to teach religious studies in a context of remarkable cultural and religious diversity, and to learn more about how religious identity was shaping the personal and social identities and the outlooks of young people. Identity issues which are explored so enjoyably in this classic text, which is set in the part of London I was working, and many of you are probably familiar with. And if you don't know it, I warmly recommend it. Bend it like Beckham. After 3 years at the school, which I combined with a part-time evening master's in education at the University of London, a move to Roehampton offered a chance to teach theology at university level in a department of theology and religious studies. And it also allowed me to continue part-time study and start my PhD at Heathrop College, University of London. Heathrop had a Jesuit foundation and excellent international links, so it was a great place to return to my interests in liberation theology. In fact, it had established a partnership with the Catholic Development Agency, CAFOD, for a scholarship which would support a student studying liberation theology. And I was lucky enough to be offered this for a year, which allowed me to make the first of 2 visits to El Salvador as part of my doctoral work. And this in turn drew me back into the church in Central America and Romero's own life and work. My work on liberation theology as a movement, dating from this time, eventually led to my book, Latin American Liberation Theology, which was published in 2002. I can take no credit at all for the beautiful cover design, the Quechua way of the cross, but I am very honoured that the Marian fathers and brothers gave permission for its use, and pleased that if people do judge my book by its cover, they'll get a good impression. The book develops the idea of liberation theology as a movement in 2 senses. First, it was not just about ideas and thoughts. It was also an organised collective movement within the church that sought to reach out beyond the church to make a concrete difference in the wider world. Second, both the theological ideas and the outworking of the ideas in the organised movement developed and grew in distinctive stages. One can think about Latin American liberation theology as a reasonably cohesive entity, but it's also important to distinguish distinctive phases in its development. Its backgrounds and origins were in the 1950s and 1960s, and these built on Catholic social teaching and the spirit of Catholic renewal initiated by Vatican II in the early 1960s. A spirit of renewal, incidentally, that will be marked by a series of 3 lectures on living faith in the world offered by the Catholic Education Council here next week, which might be of interest to some of you. Then, the formal emergence of liberation theology can be dated fairly precisely to the year 1968, and 3 separate events that launched it that year. One was Gutierrez's conference paper, Notes on a Theology of Liberation, which outlined the key insights to be elaborated more fully in his influential book 3 years later. Another was the meeting of the Latin American bishops at Medellin in Colombia, where they committed the church to the needs of the poor. And the third event of 1968 was the decision by the Jesuit provincials of Latin America to make the social problems of Latin America an absolute priority in our apostolic strategy. Following this, the 1970s was a decade of development and growth, with an initial emphasis up until 1975 on economic theory and a political analysis of poverty, new things for theologians to be doing. But then in the second half of the decade, a shift towards a more experiential encounter with poor communities and new directions from this encounter. In the 1980s, liberation theology extended its scope in dialogue with other third world theologies, as it sought to bear witness to a God of life in contexts that were often marked by death and suffering. During this time, it also faced strong opposition from the Vatican and was forced to clarify and refine some of its positions from the early 1970s. And in addition, there was more attention to spirituality. Many of the most nuanced works in liberation theology date from this period, the 1980s. Finally, liberation theology lost momentum as a movement in the 1990s. The end of the Cold War, the transition in many Latin American countries from authoritarian regimes back to democracy, accompanied by continuing hostility from church authorities, created a crisis of direction. Important new work was done on issues like the environment, but as a church and social movement, it now lost its direction and its momentum. That said, by this time, its influence had been absorbed by many faith-based development agencies around the world. And this is a practical legacy that it has continued to leave. In addition, we might identify 3 features that are also significant parts of its theological legacy. First, the methodology of the second step. Liberation theology demonstrated that you do not always have to start theology with theology. You can also start with the realities of life as they are concretely lived out, and then seek a deeper understanding of them through careful analysis, and then move on to theology as a second step or second act of critical and creative reflection leading to further engagement. Second, the term liberation and its transformational power as theological language. The language of liberation brought together faith and social action in a powerful way. Liberation named what Gutierrez described as 3 interrelated levels of a single holistic reality, in which spirituality, human experience, and politics all came together. And the third aspect, a preferential option. Liberation theology took a theological and ethical decision to stand alongside those that it said God had shown a preferential love for, especially the world's powerless, oppressed, and marginalized, to see life from their perspective and to make itself accountable to them in a significant way. A liberation theologian that I became particularly interested in was the Basque Jesuit John Sobrino. Sobrino had arrived in El Salvador as a 19-year-old in 1957. During the years that followed, he left for long periods of theological training in other countries in the Jesuit tradition, but he kept returning for short periods, and in 1974 he returned for good. He was based at the University of Central America in San Salvador, which had been founded by the Society of Jesus in 1965 and was known as the UCA. From the mid-1970s, Sobrino worked alongside fellow Spanish Jesuit Ignacio Echeverría at the UCA, and it became a well-known center of liberation theology. Sobrino says, in a memorable phrase that despite his long theological training, it was only after returning to El Salvador in 1974 that he started to awaken from the sleep of inhumanity, when he started to confront the realities of poverty, oppression, and violence experienced in El Salvador, and to use this to rethink a distinctively Latin American perspective on Christology. Between 1977 and 1980, Ellacuría, Sobrino, and Romero worked together in their thinking on the crucified people. This drew on St. Paul's writing on the church as the present body of Christ, and perhaps also a little on El Salvador, the country's name, the Saviour. Sobrino's book, Christology from Latin America, published in 1976, offers a powerful image of this resemblance, representing the whole of Latin America as a Christ-like figure on the cross. It echoed an idea that the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas had in the 16th century, when he discerned Christ's presence in the suffering Indians of the Caribbean. Writing to the Spanish king, Las Casas complained that he had seen Jesus Christ, our God, scourged and afflicted and crucified not once, but millions of times in the Indies. For Sobrino, the language of a crucified people was relevant to the Salvadoran context in two different ways. First, there were those who were crucified slowly by structural poverty, oppression, and exploitation. Second, there were those who were crucified quickly at the hands of death squads and the military if they tried to protest the unjust situation. As he put it, if they resist, they are crucified suddenly and violently. If they do not resist, they are crucified gradually and slowly. The risk of a sudden and violent death had been confirmed in the murder of Romero at the start of the decade, and in November 1989, Ellacuría, 5 other Jesuits, their housekeeper and her teenage daughter, were executed by a military death squad. Sobrino only escaped because he had been out of the country at the time. In light of these crucifixions, both the slow and the sudden, Sobrino summarized the social task before the church as a challenge to take down the victims from the cross, a challenge that I will come back to later. By the time my book on liberation theology appeared in 2002, I'd recently started a new job at Trinity College Dublin to establish a new master's degree programme in reconciliation studies. It was an unusual appointment because instead of working in Dublin, in the beautiful and relatively tranquil surroundings of the university, the appointment was to live and work in Belfast, Northern Ireland, so as to be grounded along with the students in a post-conflict society. I was interested in exploring the challenges of reconciliation in both political and theological terms, especially because many liberation theologians viewed reconciliation with suspicion as a distraction from the real issue of liberation. But Northern Ireland was its own distinctive context, with its own history of injustice and violence. Despite the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it was still a deeply divided society, with some Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods separated by so-called peace walls that stood 10 metres high or taller. Reconciliation had to be taken as a pressing issue, and like the theology of liberation, a socially engaged theology of reconciliation could make a difference to how people saw themselves and their neighbours. Our move to Northern Ireland meant learning more about religion, politics, and conflict in a place that was much closer to home than Latin America, but about which I initially knew very little. Early in our time in Belfast, a kind neighbour was giving me a lift in his car when he pointed across the road and said, "That's a rough pub, David. When you go in there, they search you for guns. If you don't have one, they give you one." I think he was probably joking. I certainly hope he was, but I never went inside to find out. Belfast was a much more peaceful place during our time there than it had been during the Troubles, but there was still quite a high level of violence. This loyalist mural on the road where we lived was a reminder of paramilitary presence, which was always close by. 2 cases of paramilitary violence during my 13 years there were memorable for different reasons. One was a crucifixion in November 2002 of an alleged local joyrider, Harry McCartan, in another area of Belfast. McCartan was a Catholic who was beaten and nailed to a fence by loyalist paramilitaries, possibly as a parody of the crucifix, but certainly as a warning to others and as a punishment. It was particularly shocking because although he survived, it was disturbing in itself, and it was also disturbing that at least some people in the area that it happened supported that it had happened. Another incident was the murder by Republicans of a local Catholic man, Robert McCartney, in January 2005. A fracas had developed in a pub, and on the signal of a senior Republican, McCartney had been taken outside into the alley and stabbed. An estimated 70 people were in the bar at the time, but nobody called an ambulance or the police. The murder investigation was hampered by a wall of silence. Before the police could investigate the crime scene, the CCTV recordings had been destroyed and the pub forensically cleaned. According to newspapers, nearly everyone who admitted to being present claimed that they were in the toilets at the time. Some commentators pointed out that if these claims were to be taken at face value, then the pub was probably the only one in the world in which the toilets had the properties of Doctor Who's TARDIS, being much bigger inside than they appeared to be on the outside. The McCartney murder showed how strong the culture of not knowing, or at least not saying, could still be. This slogan, in the Catholic neighbourhood of Short Strand, which was where McCartney had lived and was home to many of those who had been in the pub, was signed, notionally, with the name P. O'Neill. This was the name used when the Provisional IRA made its official statements. The Ulster saying, "Whatever you say, say nothing," which features in a Seamus Heaney poem, was a clear message that it was best to know nothing. Like the people in the pub in Belfast, I suspect many of us find it easier to not know things. Not knowing, or at least not acknowledging, seems to be the safe and easy option. It allows us to evade responsibilities and not take action. By contrast, knowing and acknowledging might lead us into action. Actions involve effort and sometimes risk, when not knowing seems to avoid these. At Otago, our university motto is Sapere Aude, the Latin dare to know, and it's often translated as dare to be wise. It comes to us from the Roman writer Horace, and it was echoed and picked up by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. It is, I think, an invitation not just to know things, but to be bold and daring in what we know. In Horace, it is given some extra urgency by the word incipii, immediately afterward, meaning get started, begin. For Horace, there is a sense of urgency and an encouragement that time should not be lost, because knowing things should make a difference to our lives and how we live them. In similar spirit, this Romero mural features the words of Jesus to the disciples in John 8:32, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." During the 1990s, both El Salvador and Guatemala were working through a peace process, and both held truth commissions as part of their peace agreements. Truth commissions are one way to face up to what are often painful truths about what happened. This biblical faith, in truth, John 8:32, alongside James Cone's advice to be attentive to what are the questions not being asked, and an awareness from Belfast of the pressures to not know that we all feel, encouraged me to take a particular interest in the things that we don't want to know. Drawing on liberation theology and Sobrino's Christology of crucified people in particular, this has prompted me in my research to look at what we do not want to know about the cross and crucifixion, and to ask why we don't want to know it. Because of this, some of my research has involved reading the Truth Commission reports from El Salvador and Guatemala, along with torture reports from Argentina, Brazil, and other Latin American countries, and then using these to identify new questions that might be asked about crucifixion in Roman times and in the gospel texts. In my article, Crucifixion, State Terror and Sexual Abuse, 1999, I argued for a reading of the gospel accounts of the stripping and crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth that explicitly named what happened as a form of sexual abuse. This was not because Latin American torture reports or any other documentation or contemporary experience can directly disclose what is in the biblical text or determine its meaning. But what a contemporary context can do is to open up a new perspective from which different questions can be asked. A first step was to consider whether Roman crucifixion practices in general could be examined more systematically as a form of torture. The idea that Roman crucifixions were a form of torture was not particularly original, but as far as I know, nothing had been done to investigate the implications of this in any depth by studying typical torture practices. This seemed like a significant gap, because studies of Latin American torture suggested at least two considerations that might be relevant. First, to understand the politics of Latin American torture, it's necessary to understand that torture was usually directed against a much wider target than just the individual victim. Torture in Latin America functioned to intimidate and terrorize the whole society. It was not just aimed against the individual. Second, it was striking how common it was for Latin American torture to include sexual humiliations, sexual abuses, and acts of sexual violence. Reading Roman writers with an awareness of these two issues confirmed that there is ample evidence in ancient sources that crucifixions functioned as a form of state terror, not just individual punishment, that Roman tortures often involved sexual humiliations, abuse and violence, and that the practice of stripping victims naked for crucifixion was in accordance with the use of crucifixion as a form of torture, and this included sexual humiliation, which was a form of abuse. Now, if these characteristics were significant for Roman crucifixions in general, the next question had to be whether this offered a helpful new perspective on the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in particular. And this question provided the starting point for a fresh reading of the gospel texts with which we think we are familiar. And I argued that the stripping and exposure of Christ on the cross, which is clearly attested in the Gospels, is fully consistent with the Roman use of crucifixion as a form of state terror involving sexual humiliation, and that this should therefore be named as sexual abuse. This work was not original in saying that crucifixion was torture, and it was not original in saying that Jesus was stripped and crucified naked. However, it was the first time that these 2 points were brought together in the context of a wider understanding of torture and sexual humiliation. It was also the first time that they had been used to name what should have been self-evident, that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse. I say it should be self-evident because my consistent experience since publishing the article is that when people first hear the startling suggestion that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, they think they have misheard or I am not being serious. However, they are often quickly persuaded because in many cases they have previously heard that Jesus was crucified naked, but they have never heard it called sexual abuse before. But when it is named as sexual abuse, people say it is so obvious that it is incredible that they have never heard it called that before. One reason that it remains a startling idea is that it is still very rare for artists to depict Christ as naked during crucifixion. The work of New Zealand artist Colin McCann is unusual in this regard. His sequence of works on crucifixion, many of which were done in 1947, so it's by no means a new phenomenon, bring out the element of humiliation in crucifixion in an unavoidable way. I suspect that some of you are more familiar with McCann and his work than I am, so I would much appreciate to talk to anyone afterwards who has a particular interest in him. As you can see, this image features a lamp, as if to shed light on the darkness of the cross. In this image, also featuring a lamp, he seems to invite us to step up and take a closer look at what is really going on. There are 2 points that are worth drawing out on why naming and representing the cross in terms of sexual abuse is important. First, the act of naming can create a new relation to a subject and increase control of it. As educators, we help students to name experiences in new ways and thereby help them to think more deeply and insightfully about things that they may already know in some way and to some extent, but they have not previously had the tools to analyse and reflect upon. The role of naming in the Genesis creation story supports this. Genesis 1 presents naming as a key part in God's creative process. In addition to the power of naming, visual representations can make a huge difference of our awareness of issues, especially when they give us a human face to what otherwise might be abstract. Christian World Service reported today that nearly 4 million people have fled Syria and another 8 million are displaced within the country. Most of these refugees have taken shelter in neighbouring countries. Last week, this crisis was given an individual human face in the photos of Kurdish toddler Aylan Kurdi. He is shown here in the arms of a Turkish police officer after he drowned with his mother and brother as they tried to cross from Turkey to the Greek island of Kos. There was debate on social media as to whether the image should be shown, but there is little doubt that it had a power to move and prompt action, and very likely contributed to a greater political commitment in Europe to addressing the crisis this week. In light of Sobrino's theology on taking the crucified down from the cross, the image might invite Christians to reflect on whether, if refugees stay where they are often crucified gradually and slowly. If they seek to escape, they might be crucified suddenly and violently. How are the churches to respond to those who are crucified in either of these ways? Aylan in the arms of the police officer might also suggest to Christians the image of the dead Jesus in the arms of Mary, seen here in McCann's Entombment after Titian, which presents the women bringing Jesus down from the cross so that his body could be cared for. Of course, Christians need to remember that speaking of refugees as crucified people in our context in this metaphorical way can be misunderstood, and great care will be needed if it is to be done respectfully and appropriately. However, Sobrino's work encourages us to think more about whether and how this can be done. The legacy of liberation theology can also provide inspiration in another area of research that I am currently exploring in relation to victims of sexual abuse. Does the naming does naming crucifixion as a form of sexual abuse and naming Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse change the sense that survivors of abuse have of Christ and the cross, and/or their sense of themselves? If naming Christ and the cross more explicitly in terms of sexual abuse can be a positive and healing process for survivors, it would suggest that churches could be far more active in this issue and in future than they have been in the past. Since 2010, Tear Fund, a UK-based faith development agency, has been involved in building national and global movements with churches and other partners in a coalition called We Will Speak Out. And it's published 2 significant reports, Silent No More, 2011, and Breaking the Silence, 2013, based on research at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa, which is one of our partners in the Global Network for Public Theology. One of the key findings in the reports is that survivors of sexual abuses identify the churches as the institutions that are best placed to help them. Yet they also report that the church all too often fails to respond to their needs, and this is partly because the church does not see sexual abuse as a theological issue. This lack of interest from the church often reinforces the shame, stigma, and silence that survivors are struggling with. It's worse than useless. It deepens the problem. As one survivor is quoted as saying in Breaking the Silence, "I choose to die silently. You're too scared to talk about it, and you don't know who to tell." If this were to change, if sexual abuse came to be seen as a central element in the Christian understanding of the cross, and the experience of Christ was named in these terms, it could make an enormous difference to how the churches respond to sexual abuse and how some of the most vulnerable and victimized people feel about themselves and are treated with dignity by others. Breaking the Silence suggests that the churches in South Africa could take very modest and practical actions to help survivors in big ways. For example, it mentions a willingness of church members to accompany those who go to police stations to report that they have been abused. A small act, but an important way to assist the person concerned, to signal that the church takes the issue seriously, and to indicate to the police that the incident should not be dismissed or trivialized as a purely private matter. In some cases, survivors might even experience this small solidarity and support as being helped down from a cross of silence, stigma, and indifference. So this evening, I've tried to speak to 3 areas. First, some of my own encounter with liberation theology and what it's meant to me at a personal level. Second, what made liberation theology distinctive and how it developed and grew as a movement. I have identified 3 elements that I think are crucial to this and which shaped it as a theological enterprise and movement. The methodology of the second step, the transformative power of the term liberation, and what this continues to show us about the importance of language and how we name things in bringing them together in new ways, and the preferential option it made for the poor and marginalized. Finally, I concluded with an example of how insights and inspirations from liberation theology might contribute to the Church's response to the refugee crisis, and how it also shapes my own research on a Christian response to torture and sexual abuse. Thank you for coming. If you are already familiar with liberation theology, I hope I have offered what you see as a fair account. If it's new to you, I hope this evening will make you want to do what I did first when I picked up Gutierrez's book in Blackwell's bookshop. And you will want to read more liberation theology from yourself and decide on what you think it has to offer. And if you do, please be sure to let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Toombs. While liberation theology as a movement may, as you say, have come to an end in the 1990s, you've reminded us in your lecture that liberation in all its forms remains a very vital concern for many people the world over. You've also demonstrated the role that public theology can play in challenging us and our churches to face up to issues and indeed to images that we would rather turn our faces away from, whether from sexual violence and domestic abuse, which in New Zealand is perhaps rather more often hidden than public, or from the much more public suffering of refugees in the Mediterranean. I would say that I would confess that I often find reading theology rather difficult, but reading David's theology I found difficult in a very different way, in the kind of unflinching focus that you placed on very difficult aspects of his history of the churches and the revolutions in Central America, but also in rereading the Gospels through those lenses. So you have made a great start in addressing these issues, both in your lecture tonight and also in the events that the Centre has already organised under your leadership, and we look forward to hearing much more, both through these events and also through your published work and the work of students and staff associated with the Centre. For now, please accept this gift as a token of our appreciation for your lecture and for the work that you do.